的这个战略模糊，还有双重吓阻是有这些批判。那这个应该他一开始所讲的对于我们目前美台关系，也可以说是讲给美国听的啦就是不要因为战略模糊还有双重吓阻让台湾变成无所适从。那么也等于是帮北京在钳制台湾的作为这个部分是我想赖义忠先生提出来的。那么关于这个跟云层的比较我觉得云层是比较纯粹从美国的这个角度来分析那么赖义忠也提醒说在80年代初期其实状况是很糟糕的。我们不必把台湾关系法说的那么神那么有先见之明其实它还是一步一步来的如果没有民主化，没有台湾认同的提升的话，你很难去挑战当初的那种一中政策或者一中框架所以这里面也是说，其实并不是只有美中两大国的因素在影响事情而已我们台湾自己的民主化，自己的台湾认同的提升。其实也会影响到这些问题我想接下来就换William。
首先我应该说对不起，因为我中文不够好。给演讲这样子，可是如果你听不懂我的英文，大概你可以看得懂。所以我的表演、我的看法都是在这本书，所以你可以看一看。如果我说中文，大概就让你糊涂了。很简单的来说，有10年 there were 10 years. During approximately 10 years, during which, from 1972 to 82, when we had the 3 communiques, they were all flawed documents. They all had problems. And it's in response to those flawed documents that we had action by the US Congress with the Taiwan Relations Act and also the 6 assurances from President Reagan to try to correct some of the consequences of the 3 communiques. Clearly, one of the reasons there were so many mistakes is that people like Henry Kissinger had never been to Taiwan, had no knowledge of it, no understanding. To this day, he's never been to Taiwan. So their expectations were that Taiwan, it's quite clear from the historical record, Taiwan would die. It would dwindle and it would disappear. So you didn't have to worry about it. And they also thought that China, they had this vision of China, a giant country, which would again become a friend, as they had been during World War II, would become a friend of the United States. So, and we would prosper together, and we would have long-term, beneficial, strategic, economic, and political relations. All that was wrong. In fact, I always emphasize at least 5 or 6 mistakes that we made in our conception of what our relationship with China and Taiwan would be. One is we thought that geostrategically we had common interests and that we would permanently divide the Soviet Union, Russia, from China. That never worked. That proved failure. We thought that we would get concrete cooperation from China on key issues, whether Vietnam, North Korea, Iran, non-proliferation. None of that proved true. Never made any real progress. Why? Because we have different values and different interests. Third of all, we thought that liberalization would bring about, from economic cooperation, would transform China into a more liberal society. That proved wrong, particularly when Xi Jinping came to power. So bilateral trade we thought would benefit the United States. Well, maybe some companies, because the huge drop in manufacturing employment in the United States. We also underestimated, I think, China's political, economic weaknesses, but also, particularly with the rise of Xi Jinping, we had greatly underestimated China's belligerence towards other countries. And finally, no one had ever predicted, we all underestimated Taiwan's ability within a 40-year period, really from 1986 to 96, to transform itself into a prosperous and modern democracy. So, I'm not going to go into all the flaws, but in general, Randy Shriver and Dan Blumenthal have pointed out that it's hard to think of another set of relationships still governed by joint communiques from the Cold War era. There were Cold War thinking, and the Cold War ended, and they became more meaningless than ever. I've often pointed out the Shanghai Communique is factually incorrect because nobody asked people on both sides of the straits what they thought. China was in the Cultural Revolution, and Chiang Kai-shek was not going to ask the people of Taiwan what they wanted. So that was flawed. The second communique had ambiguous language that we acknowledged the Chinese position, there's but one China. We didn't accept it, we didn't agree with it, but the Chinese have always interpreted acknowledge as Chengren. So they always interpret it, because we also had this funny agreement where our English version would be binding for us, their Chinese version would be binding for them. So we had two different interpretations of what we had agreed to. And they've taken advantage of that. So there's a constant confusion between the one China policy, the one China principle, and what it means when we acknowledge the Chinese position. I always say, I may acknowledge you think I'm crazy, but that doesn't mean I agree with you. 有可能你觉得我是神经病，可是不一定我同意你的看法。Okay, the second solution, communique, one of the things that people don't pay any attention to, and that we don't repeat often enough, is it was clearly predicated on a peaceful solution of any difficulties between Taiwan and China. And second of all, that we would respect the human rights of the Taiwan people. 人权是非常重要的. So now, we never repeat that. We have our spokesman come out, but they never talk about that aspect of the second communique. We said we will, it means the force of law. It's not a suggestion, but it means we will, and we haven't always lived up to it, to give Taiwan the arms it needs. The third joint communique was a total disaster. It was because Alexander Haig was frightened by the threats from Deng Xiaoping that it would harm our relationship if we continued to sell arms. So we came up with this ambiguous formula that, that the quantity and quality of arms provided will be conditioned entirely on the threat, opposed to PRC. But we've never abided by it anyway. The U.S. never paid any attention to it, really. Indeed, Alexander Haig, once he left government, he was fired over this communique in part by President Reagan. He went to work for United Technologies, and he was trying to sell arms to both China and Taiwan. So it was he was really quite hypocritical about this issue. So we came up with the 6 assurances, although unfortunately they weren't even published officially until Congress put them in legislation in 2016. We should have much earlier made a clear announcement of what our policy was. So as you can see, the substance, the history of US agreements and policies on Taiwan, they're complicated, and they can't be explained by just saying one China policy. So what can the US do? Well, one clear step is one of the things that was most onerous about our relationship with China based on these resolutions is we told the lawyers in Washington to come up with rules so that we wouldn't violate our concept of breaking diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So this is an actual paper that used to be given out, I don't know what they give people now, of Taiwan do's and don'ts. And it said, do use Taiwan don't use Republic of China. That wouldn't make the Kuomintang happy. Don't use Republic of China. But anyway, don't refer to it. Do use economy, island, area, or jurisdiction. Don't use country. Well, I used to say country all the time when I was AIT director. Nobody ever noticed, or maybe people stopped caring. But I actually sat in a meeting during that time with a person, a very high-level government official, who, in a meeting with Ma Ying-jeou, continually referred to Taiwan as an important economic entity. I mean, nobody says that in English. It's just silly. So we had all these do's and don'ts for Taiwan. And we also, at that time, we designed, based on the Japanese model, AIT Washington and CCNAA. And they were designed to serve as cutouts. But quickly, nobody went through CCNAA. We went directly to ministries, and Taiwan was happy about that. But many people, the Taiwanese at TechGrow, they continue to go to AIT Washington. I'm going to write an article one of these days about why we should get rid of AIT Washington and why we should get rid of CCNA. I never used to meet but once a year with CCNAA. We would have a polite, for protocolary reasons, we would have a polite dinner or lunch together. So other restrictions were made on what buildings Taiwanese diplomats could go in. But I've talked to a lot of European countries, and for years, Taiwan diplomats up to the level of assistant secretary could call on, in many cases, could call on European foreign ministries. So we were always very harsh about that. We also made all people serving in AIT to give up their diplomatic or their official passports, huzhou. And as a result of that, in 2002, Congress passed legislation. That was one of the first steps since the Taiwan Relations Act to try to pull back all these commitments we made to China. It said active duty military officers and US diplomats could work at AIT. They didn't have to be retired, and they didn't have to go through a phony retirement where you turn in your passport because they didn't trust you, you might use it. During all those years, there are many countries, there are some Southeast Asian countries I could name, who continued to use diplomatic passports. Why? Because who would know? Taiwan wasn't going to object. So, it was these self-limitations. So what are some of the simple measures? 比较简单的做事我们可以采取。First, in my view, every time the spokesman for the State Department talks about Taiwan, stop saying one China policy. It has different meanings for Beijing and for Washington, and it's imprecise, it's inaccurate, it's misleading, it's confusing. Just don't say it anymore. We can describe our policy in other ways, including emphasizing, U.S. commitment to human rights, U.S. commitment to peaceful settlement of any disputes. That's what we should talk about. We should stop always referring to the three communiques as if we're a minister in a church and we're talking about the Bible. It's not that. The first, as I pointed out, is factually incorrect because people on both sides of the strait were never asked what they thought. The third was repudiated by the 6 assurances. You could take a look at Joseph Bosco's excellent article, Scrap the Third Communique with China, Keep the 6 assurances. And then finally, we should retract President Clinton's commitment that he made in his effusive desire to make Beijing happy when he visited China in '98. When I was at the embassy there, that the U.S. would not support Taiwan's participation in any international organization for which statehood is required. That contradicts the Taiwan Relations Act, which is law, which says in Section 4D, nothing in this act may be construed as a basis for supporting the exclusion or expulsion of Taiwan from continued membership in any international financial or organization or international organization. And I think Washington should repeatedly emphasize again that all of our agreements were predicated on a peaceful resolution of cross-strait problems, and regularly call attention and emphasize China's acts of intimidation and coercion against Taiwan and other neighbors. And finally, we should halt the restrictions on where Taiwanese diplomats can go. And you'll see in a bit, that's what US Congress is now recommending. We should, of course, continue to support and strengthen Taiwan's defense forces. We should also initiate the high-level exchanges that the Taiwan Travel Act called for, but which, as far as I know, haven't happened yet. We should prioritize reaching a free trade agreement with Taiwan. I was very happy to see that Ed Fulner, formerly the Heritage Foundation, says there's movement in Congress now to do that. It's a silly dispute. It's silly both on the side of the US, because we have bigger issues with Taiwan's strategic interests, but it's also silly for Taiwan because only 1.8% of your GDP depends on agriculture. 农业没有那么重要的在台湾。We should also support US corporate resistance to changing names because the PRC demands it. You know, if they want to cut flights and say, well, then you can't fly to Beijing, okay, then Chinese aircraft can't fly to the United States. I mean, we should have a much tougher tit-for-tat attitude towards China, okay? So, and I'm happy to see some of the measures that I mentioned are now being proposed in the Congress. We should remind the PRC of its own words, including what it said was its position in the 72 communique. Wherever there's oppression, there is resistance. Countries want independence. Nations want liberation. All nations, big or small, should be equal. Big nations should not bully the small, and strong nations should not bully the weak. China will never be a superpower, and it opposes hegemony and power politics of any kind. We should feed these words back to them on a regular basis, force it down their throats, so they remember what they used to say, because they're bullying everybody now, okay? Whether it's over threatening Canada, because we want to extradite one of their officials who is secretly supplying sensitive materials to, or technology to Iran. And also they said, we want people of all countries to have the right to choose their social systems according to their own wishes, and the right to safeguard independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Suggestions for what Taiwan should do. One is, I've been a long advocate, advertise Taiwan's successes as well as its contributions to the world. Devote more diplomatic resources, not only to diplomatic allies, but to important capitals, Berlin, Tokyo, Washington. Continue to strengthen defense forces. I was sad to see that apparently your percentage of GDP going to defense is still only 2%. Overcome domestic obstacles to free trade. Do a better job, I hope you're doing it, or you wouldn't read about it, but counter multifaceted PRC influence and espionage operations in Taiwan. I personally would advocate avoiding unnecessary political divisions and public criticism of the Taiwan government, which China can use in its united front tactics. You know, even if you're not all satisfied with Tsai Ing-wen, I'll tell you two things. Washington likes her because they know she's not going to do anything crazy. And second of all, the chance that you're going to get somebody who has views closer to your own elected, what you may wind up doing is giving the government to people who want one country and two systems. So you have to be very calculating about your political decisions. That's my personal view. Stress that, we should stop talking about the 92 consensus, because I don't think a consensus ever existed, because you can't have a consensus where one side says one formula and the other side says gabiao. I mean, it's just, we should, you know, you can continue to talk about, you know, Taiwan's name, its flag, its national anthem, but realistically bear in mind that, you know, divisions over such issues and possible retaliation from China, you know, may be too harsh a penalty to pay. I'm much more for substantive changes in Taiwan's relationship with the United States and other countries. As you know, U.S. congressional administrative support remains very strong, but you also know Washington's policies are not always predictable, to put it mildly. But since 2016, 我们的态度对台湾越来越积极的, so very positive. So we got, you know, resolutions in May of 2016, December 2016, all calling for higher level, you know, reaffirming the 6 assurances, Taiwan Relations Act, but also calling for higher level exchanges. There were reports in April and June of 2018 that we were going to exchange more technology, give Taiwan the technology in defense that it needs. Then in March, Taiwan Travel Act, very important development. But as near as I can tell, nobody at a high level has come, unless they're doing it secretly on the military level. I'm not aware of that, though. There was signed into law, significant things about it, as I've pointed out in the past. It re-emphasized any effort to determine the future of Taiwan by other than peaceful means is a threat to peace and security in the Pacific area and a grave concern to the United States. So maintain high-level visits and so forth. But it also called Taiwan a beacon of democracy, an anchor for peace and security. And for the first time, it said visits to a country by US cabinet members. That's an indirect way of saying Taiwan is such a country. It's actually referring in public to Taiwan indirectly as a country, acknowledging that existence, indicator of the breadth and depth of relations between the United States and such a country. Then we had, again in 2019 and another one in 2018, a Further Defense Authorization Act, which gave a lot of focus to Taiwan, calling for predictability of arms sales. And that seems to now be happening. We've approved, as far as I know, in the United States, the sale of F-16Vs, the new model, which Taiwan wanted. There's a myth out there that, you know, the F-35 was, you know, rejected because it was considered too advanced. What I heard from an arms company was the problem was they looked at it, and if you have an F-35, it takes off vertically. It means it uses up fuel more rapidly. It means it carries less, it carries fewer weapons, and it's less maneuverable once it's in the air. So it's not necessary, you have to calculate weapons not on what's got the best number, but on what it can actually do for you and what you can use most effectively. The Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, you know, again, it's kind of hortatory. I mean, it's just encouraging, but calls for regular transfers of defense articles. We more recently, just in January, Senator Gardner, he's a Republican from Colorado, he calls for the State Department to report every 6 months on U.S. actions to affirm and strengthen Taiwan's relations with alliances with other countries, and says that in the event we know a country is going to drop its relationship, we should have the ability to downgrade U.S. relations and U.S. support for such countries. In other words, you may be getting more money from China, but you're going to lose the support and a relationship with the United States that you now enjoy. And also, you know, both foreign assistance and our diplomatic ties. And he particularly submitted this after Xi Jinping threatened Taiwan, saying that, you know, they deserve the right to use force, and they better, you know, we're offering the one country, two systems. We also had 6 Republican and Democratic U.S. senators just a little while ago, on March 26, proposed the Taiwan Assurance Act, which urges Taiwan to increase its defense spending, okay, but it also calls on the Secretary of Defense to make efforts to include Taiwan forces in bilateral and multilateral military exercises. You may be aware that we excluded Taiwan from the Pacific exercise we had last year. Taiwan asked to be invited, and as far as I know, it never was. So this is a call for that. It's also saying that when you go to AIT and you want to talk to the top military officer, it should be a general officer or a flag officer, an admiral or a general. It should be higher level. It also calls for the U.S. Trade Representative to resume meetings with Taiwan under the Trade Framework Agreement to reach a bilateral free trade agreement. The second part of it also, this is important because remember I said lawyers impose all of these restrictions. But the Act calls for a review of the guidelines on relations with Taiwan. And it says that the new guidelines should be crafted with the intent to deepen and expand relations with Taiwan and be based on the value, merits, and importance of the relationship with Taiwan. It should acknowledge the reality that Taiwan is governed by a representative democratic government that is peacefully constituted through free and fair elections, and that Taiwan is a free and open society that respects universal human rights and democratic values, and ensure that any distinctions in diplomatic practice with Taiwan have to be consistent with long-standing, comprehensive, strategic, and values-based relationship the United States enjoys with Taiwan. In other words, you've got to treat it with the dignity it deserves as a fellow democracy and an ally, okay? And then finally, they ask within 6 months of the act being passed that the president has to submit a report saying what progress he's made and give a copy of the revised rules. And Senator Cotton said, China's growing aggression against Taiwan makes the U.S.-Taiwan relationship more important than ever. 40 years after the Taiwan Relations Act was passed, I introduced a bill that would further improve our relations with our strategic partner. So, despite the problems of the 3 communiques and how we started, despite all the problems over the years, the relationship is clearly going in a more positive direction, led by Congress often, but also by many people who are friends of Taiwan in the administration. And my hope is that we will see in coming years further progress in strengthening the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. Meanwhile, the U.S. should always make it very clear that, the U.S. position is that we have no interest in seeing unification of Taiwan and China until and unless China becomes a free and democratic country where the rule of law and respect for human rights are fundamental principles, and the people of Taiwan want unifications. So, and we should always say that a secure and democratic Taiwan is just as important as peaceful cross-strait relations for maintaining a stable and secure Asia. I certainly think Japan would agree with that. Thank you.